Hi, Paul.
Hi, Nick.
You all right?
Yeah, very well, thank you. How
Good
are
man.
you?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm busy.
Busy
Busy
indeed,
but
yeah.
well. So, 3 months since we were sitting on this sofa.
It can't be that long.
Time flies when we're having this much fun.
Yes, and with 31st of January as well.
Absolutely. So, 3 months on from the budget, which has caused huge ripples amongst our farming client base, understandably, and the wider rural economy. It's been a time of interesting conversation with clients, challenging conversation with clients, and at a time when we still haven't got the clarity that we would like from the government.
Yes, it's interesting because before the budget, we were doing a lot of work with clients to try and prejudge or preempt what might happen. So very busy few months leading up to the budget, and now we've got the same thing. We're partially fighting in the dark, aren't we?
Yeah, we are, and I think that's the challenge as advisors, that we've got to try and give advice exercising best judgment, but obviously that's exercising best judgment against a framework of legislation that hasn't got any clarity.
Exactly.
Clearly a lot of lobbying by the NFU and CLA in particular.
Any success?
Well, it strikes me in the first instance that there's a lot of media coverage around the impact on family farms, rightly so, and it still baffles me a little that the BPR piece for wider family businesses still seems largely silent in the media.
But they haven't got big tractors to park on the government.
I guess not, no. And there's one at Tesco's at Copdock this weekend, a number of them, so that was quite interesting. But yeah, certainly, I've subscribed to the CLA WhatsApp group, which I'd recommend anybody listening to do so, to get some insights into what's happening in terms of lobbying. And it seems strategy is obviously to keep the pressure on government and raise the profile. In terms of movement on the announcements, again, nothing substantive, which is frustrating. I think there's talk of possible age exemption. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it would make sense to me, I think, because it's come in so suddenly.
It has.
That some people, the government say, "Oh, you can plan around it." You sort of question, what's the point of introducing a tax that you can plan around anyway?
Yeah.
But if you're in your late 70s, 80s, which many working farmers are.
Well, certainly a number of the conversations I'm having and we're having as a firm are very much that, with families where the land and the farm is essentially owned by that generation who are in their early 80s. But I guess the difficulty with an age exemption is the cutoff, because there'll be winners and losers. So it'll be interesting to see whether that gains traction and how that would look. Also, possibility of a change in the limit. I think there's a general acceptance that the $1 million is rather low, and certainly, if my client base is indicative of the impact, then I can't reconcile at all the government's view as to how many farms are impacted.
No, I think one thing that they perhaps haven't taken into account is that you're not just looking at the value of the land, which typically in the old days you do an inheritance tax account on someone's death and you just value the land because it was all going to be covered by relief anyway. So they didn't look at the kit, the herd, the crops in the ground.
Yeah, which is clearly BPR rather than APR. So and then the third thing that I've sort of heard from one or two different people in different conversations is the possibility that the charge could be calculated, but they're not assessed per se, but attached to the asset that's inherited, and then tracks that asset, one assumes, until such time that asset might be sold, in which case that tax would be payable, which seems a not unreasonable outcome. Because if the family farm is, if the genuine intention is that family farm is not to be sold, then you've got this sort of spectre of a tax charge hanging over you. But ultimately, it's a can being kicked down the road until such time it is sold, when arguably it might get equitable that there should be a tax charge.
Yes, I can see the merits of that. I mean, the government do flag up the fact that the tax can be paid over 10 years with no interest.
Yes.
But as we found, some of the figures you've run on your clients, that still doesn't wash.
No, it doesn't wash, because I think, as we touched on, I think when we last spoke, certainly if you layer into what that monthly repayment would be in a business that, has a volatility in results in any event, has a need to fund capital investment, may still have legacy of borrowings from acquiring land, it is not, in many cases, it's not tenable to have that sort of payment going through, despite the fact it's interest-free credit. And I mean, that's another interesting point also, as to whether, and there's been nothing I've read or heard on this, is whether, there could be significant lines of credit granted by HMRC, and whether they would seek to take a charge, what impact that would have on any other covenants with lenders that the farm may already have. So again, it's indicative of the frustrating period this represents, that this grenade's been dropped, and we're now in a sort of vacuum of any clarity until one assumes the review of technical review, I think, of trusts, which is ongoing, and I think we're probably expecting between now and April some sort of indication as to where the government are thinking of going.
Yeah. So as you say, we're still planning in the dark.
Yep.
We've got until April 2026, which is over a year away.
Yep.
Is there anything that clients can be doing now to at least get ahead of the game? It was something I heard. It was on Farming Today, actually. There was an interview with an auctioneer and valuer from the West Country, I think. And he was saying that they are getting incredibly busy with farmers wanting to value the farm, the land, the assets, to get some sort of handle on actually what their individual problem is. Because depending on the values, it may be manageable or it may be.
I think that valuation piece is a really interesting point, actually. And only last week I had a meeting with solicitors and land agent to review a client's circumstances, and it was quite interesting because in this particular instance the land is owned by the family, but then it's let to a limited company.
Not uncommon.
Not uncommon at all. And that limited company undertakes trade, and there are some buildings that are within that tenancy that the company's converted and are letting. And obviously there are two levels there. There's the value of the client shares, and we're looking at the parents in this instance. So it's co-owned between parents and children, and the parents are in their sort of mid-70s. So again, you're looking to think, well, we should take some action. But this is, and this is indicative of some of the challenges I think that we're starting to sort of stumble into. So talking to the land agent, we've got, I don't know, about probably 1,100-1,200 acres of land. So you think, well, £10,000 an acre. But obviously that's if there wasn't the covenant on the tenancy, on the tenancy to the company. So we then had the issue, well, actually this tenancy could be quite helpful because it could suppress the value of the land, as is not uncommon when you've got these sort of tenancy arrangements. And clearly, some instances where it's an old style tenancy, that tenant right is very secure. So that discount in the land value is significant. But the discussion followed, well, okay, if we gain in this hand because we can suppress the value of the land for the purpose of the gift of that land, then the quid pro quo is that the tenant right must have a value, because the tenant right broadly is because of the suppression in value of the land that the landowner has. So then that tenant right as a value manifests in the company as the tenant, which then has an impact on the value of the shares that the parents would continue to own. Because in that instance, one advantage of that instance is they could give the land away. Obviously, they would forego the rent, which one has to when one gives something away. But we could still manage their income by virtue of dividend and salary within the company. And that adjustment to income is very relevant, isn't it, to if you are choosing to make gifts?
Absolutely, yes. You've got to be so careful of the gift reservation of benefit rules. I mean, just looking at the company, one of the advantages there might be that if there's multiple share ownership, you've got a fragmentation of the value. Although, of course, if you're looking at husband and wife, they'll be aggregated. But if you could get other family members, perhaps next generation.
And in that instance, there's a trust that owns shares. So that also helps. But then that's where, again, you're having interesting conversations with our corporate finance colleagues. And corporate finance, agriculture, valuation of shares, quasi-partnership rules. So all of these different channels are starting to become relevant to these discussions. At a time when, again, it comes down to best judgment during uncertain legislation. So that valuation point, and in this particular instance, the land agent has gone away to finesse his calculations, because that's going to inform us as to what the shape of the gift might need to be to try and make the best informed judgment as to values within the £1 billion exemption as things stand. And interestingly, if the threshold were to go up to, say, 5 million in that instance, then that would largely mitigate much of the challenge we're trying to sort out. But should we proceed with the gift because of age, etc.? So, and that's, I can think of a couple of 3 examples where we've got that interaction between a tenancy and the farming business and that valuation methodology. So I think that's something that, and the land agent made a very good point actually, because where you have one of these really old style tenancies, that, respect to this land agent, he's got, sufficient experience where he can remember these being more prevalent than they are now.
Right.
And he made the point, does the district valuer have that knowledge to actually deal with these sort of issues? Which is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yes. Because, I mean, in my experience, the district valuer has been fairly quiet of late, but I suspect that they'll be rolling their heads again. They'll be quite very busy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, in other instances, you're essentially, my experience, and you're finding each conversation is very different because each circumstance is very nuanced.
Yeah.
And I think, another instance where family farm, but husband owns all of the land in the farmhouse and wife hasn't been a partner in the farm, hasn't actually had an interest in the property. So in that instance, her £1 million exemption is not available. So you think, well, actually, let's put everything in joint names. But then, of course, the wife would then have to be brought into the partnership. And then, of course, you would have to actually own and be in that partnership for 2 years.
2 years.
Before we unlock the relief. So again, that's something that needs to be factored in terms of timescales.
Yes.
And we still aren't certain with trusts.
Nope.
And in some conversations where you're expressing potentially a preference to favour one child against others, and where potentially there's a difference in view between parents as to who should benefit, trust could be a sensible vehicle to do so. But again, if you're, there's a slight discomfort with recommending a trust when we don't actually know how the rules will sit with trusts.
No, you're right. You mentioned there possible conflict between the generations. What one bit of silver lining that this chap who was interviewed on Farming Today did point to is the fact that this whole nightmare is encouraging discussions around succession, which traditionally have been difficult, particularly in the farming community. We're seeing a lot more of that now, which is a good thing.
But in one conversation, so I'd like 3 children. I'd like of those 3 children, 2 have had very successful careers away from the farm. One child has remained on the farm and worked with father in particular, building the farm to a very successful and viable business, hence a not insignificant IHT issue. And father says, well, I'd like that son to have the farm so that he can farm. And I pointed out, well, he doesn't actually need to own the farm to farm because he can rent the farm, all of that sort of thing. So again, that's an aspect of these conversations, which trying to navigate, the emotional part, the business part, the commercial part, the tax part, is proving interesting, rewarding, but at a backdrop of trying to make that best judgment.
It's the thing that makes our sort of work really enjoyable.
Absolutely.
Is the fact that you're dealing with all those different aspects.
It's absolutely
fascinating times.
No, very much so. So I think as we sit here now, we still wait for some sort of clarity from government. Read with interest the outcome from the lobbying. I think we're trying to just, I think it's important not to rush into anything. I think one has to take a sort of a balanced view, and I think in most instances where we're having those meetings, there's a period of reflection before committing to make a decision. In some instances, there's non-core assets that could be identified that could be sold to address an IHT issue, and of course there's still this balance of making a gift with the CGT holdover versus trying to engineer an outcome where it could be inherited with a base cost uplift. That's, but again, one could argue that if there's the base cost uplift, but the farm is a multi-generational farm that's not going to be sold, then that's a less valuable gain than potentially making the gift to try and sidestep an IHT liability.
And so, still in a period of change, much more to talk about. We should get together again sometime.
It's always good to chat to you, Paul.
Have you got anything else in the pipeline that people might be interested?
Absolutely. I think we're trying to keep our clients and wider sort of community around our business informed as best we can. So we have a newsletter in the pipeline where we hope to, we intend to look at some specific case studies around some of these issues we've just chatted about. So that's in the pipeline. And of course, on the 6th of March, we have our online conference with Suffolk Ag Association and Fram Farmers. We do that we did it in person. You spoke.
I did.
I chaired the session, I think.
You did, very kindly.
Absolutely. So we had that last year in person. We have that online in March this year. I think we're just over 200 delegates registered, and that number's growing each day. So that's a good number.
And where will people find information about
that? I think they can navigate to our website, and I think it's on social media of both Suffolk Ag Association and Fram Farmers. But I always just drop either of us an email on our website, and we can send details. But that should be a really good session whereby we'll pick up some of these themes again. There's a Q&A session. We're inviting delegates to submit a question so that we can consider that before the event. And then we've got some other interesting sessions on biodiversity net gain, SFI, and I think we've got HSBC talking, which again is interesting in terms of the wider economic backdrop and interest rates, that sort of thing. So it's going to be an interesting 2025.
Certainly is.
And I'm sure we'll get together at some point in the near future.
There's at least a good harvest.
Well, drilling conditions have been fair, so let's hope there is some positive. But good to catch up with Liverpool.
Excellent, thanks, Nick.
Take care.
Cheers, you too.